God made germs. Can't say that on Christian radio. This is a podcast hosted by Main and Gabel, the afternoon show on Family Life, a radio network in New York and PA. I'm Therese Main, and in this episode, Jesse Gabel is missing because he's sick from germs. Now, I had a cold a couple weeks back, and it didn't feel great, so I've been giving Jesse lots of grace. We don't usually associate colds, illness, or germs with God. If anything, we associate them with like hand sanitizer and that face we make when somebody sneezes without covering their mouth. Ugh, okay. Germs feel like these little invaders that we can't see and we can't control, and a lot of times we can't avoid. And yet Scripture reminds us again and again that God is not only present in the grand and the glorious, but also in the small, the unseen, and the misunderstood, even in something as ordinary and inconvenient as germs. When we talk about germs from a Christian perspective, we're not minimizing illness or pain, because sickness is real, suffering is real, but so is God's sovereignty and his ability to redeem even the most frustrating parts of life. Germs, oddly enough, can be a lens through which we see God's design. Right in the beginning of the Bible, we hear God created the heavens and the earth, this sweeping declaration in Genesis 1:1. It's a statement that is both vast and also intimate, because it says God created everything, the galaxies and the grains of sand, the whales and the microorganisms. Scripture tells us that God delights in details. In Psalm 139, it says, "For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb." The same God who threads together human DNA also designed the microscopic worlds. The germs, the bacteria, the viruses, the microbes, they're all a part of this complex system that God set in motion. I wonder how many things God has made that we can't see, either because they're too big or they're too small. Not all germs are harmful to humans. In fact, a lot of them are essential. Like our bodies rely on beneficial bacteria to digest food and to fight infections. And the earth depends on microorganisms to break down waste and to keep ecosystems going. Colossians 1:16 and 17 reminds us that in him all things are created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. This phrase, visible and invisible, it matters. I'm wondering if the writer considered how many things they couldn't even see. Germs fall squarely into that invisible category, and they're held together by Jesus himself. Of course, this raises some pretty hard questions, like if God made germs, why do germs make us sick? Why do some cause suffering? Why do some even cause death? Well, Scripture always points back to the brokenness of the world after the fall. Creation itself had been subjected to frustration. It's groaning as it waits for redemption. Germs, like many parts of creation, they exist within a world that is no longer perfectly aligned with God's original design. I think during the pandemic, germs and illness caused a lot of division. Masks or no mask, tests or no tests, vaccines or no vaccines, policy and politics, they found their way into church. And it wasn't long ago that we received a complaint on Main and Gabel because we talked about the benefits of hand washing. That's it. Soap and water. They're not a spiritual issue. They're like basic hygiene, but it's amazing what a little germ can do when brought into the corruption of the world to cause such disinformation and division among us. No matter how small, God's fingerprints remain. The complexity of germs, their structure, their ability to evolve in natural order, to point to a creator who works on levels that are beyond what we could ever see as humans. Germs remind us of our humanity. We're not self-sufficient like we think. We depend on God, and not just for daily bread, but for daily breath, for daily health, for daily protection from things we can't see. Think about how God created skin. That is the greatest defense barrier we have. One of the most striking things about germs is how easily they spread. Like a single cough, a shared surface, a moment of proximity, and suddenly something invisible moves from one person to another. And some people get it, some people don't get it. Germs travel. They travel through connection, through closeness, through shared space. But Scripture shows us that God often works in the same way that germs do. There's mutual encouragement in Romans 1 that you and I may be mutually encouraged by one another's faith. Faith spreads through relationship. Hope spreads when people share stories of God's faithfulness. Love spreads when someone chooses kindness instead of indifference. And Jesus himself is an example of this. He lived among people. He touched the sick. He ate with sinners. He allowed himself to be interrupted, crowded, and surrounded. In Mark 5, we see this story of a woman who'd been bleeding for years, and she believed that if she could just touch the coat of Jesus, she would be healed. And in that moment, something invisible moved. But it wasn't sickness, it was power. Immediately, her bleeding stopped. The world teaches us to fear contagion, and sometimes that fear is reasonable. But Scripture also calls us to recognize that what we carry spiritually matters just as much as what we carry physically. Proverbs 13:20 says, "Walk with the wise and become wise, for a companion of fools suffers harm." Influence spreads, attitude spread, and peace spreads. In a world that is hyper aware of germs, Christians are invited to be intentional about the other things that we spread, grace instead of judgment, hope instead of despair, prayer instead of panic. Germs remind us that small unseen things can have a really big impact, either for harm or for good. And God invites his people to be carriers of what heals rather than what harms. I think he also gives us discernment to realize how those things will impact the people around us. The way that Jesse, a healthy 20-something, or I respond to a cold is much different than what an 80 or a 90-year-old person in a hospital might react. And so it's our good due diligence as believers who care about one another to be aware of the people around us and how our health can impact them, because we spread germs and we can spread love. One of the most frustrating things about getting sick is how it just kind of stops life. Jesse hates being off sick because it means that he loses time that he could use later on for something fun. But the body does demand rest, whether we like it or not. In a culture that glorifies busyness, sickness can feel like a failure. But Scripture paints rest as a gift, not a punishment. When sickness forces me to rest, God can minister to my heart. Psalm 46:10 says, "Be still and know that I am God." Man, sometimes I rush past stillness. I don't know about you, but when my body has to be still, when sickness slows me down, God uses that quiet space to speak to my heart in ways that he can't speak to me when I'm running around in a hurry. Illness can strip away the illusion of control, and it reminds me so much that I'm dependent on God and on other people and on grace. My grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. That's in 2 Corinthians 12. Weakness is not wasted in God's economy. It becomes a place where God's strength shows up in the most clear way. Rest during sickness can become a really sacred space, time to reflect, time to release burdens, time to be reminded that our worth is not tied to how much work we can do. Isaiah 40, verse 31 promises that those who hope in the Lord renew their strength, not those who never, ever slow down. Germs may be invisible, but God is not absent from them. They remind us of a creator who works on scales that we can't comprehend, a redeemer who uses small things to spread big impact, and a shepherd who meets us gently when our bodies are forced to rest. Germs may be inconvenient. They give us an opportunity to love others in the way that we don't share them. They can be dangerous, but we can't let them be a tool of division or something that we fear. God made them, and God has power over them. Can't say that on Christian radio.
Thanks for listening. If you liked this episode, you could subscribe, maybe. And if you really liked it, you could always say so by making a gift to Family Life, the ministry this podcast is a part of. Just go to familylife.org and find out more about what we do.
Our producer is Josh Yellen. How could we ever thank you enough? Did you know that Family Life offers a variety of podcasts? Get up to date with Family Life news, including the Noon Report and the 5 o'clock reports, or enjoy some family time with Family Life Kids. There's If That Makes Sense, a conversation for Christians in their 20s. They're all free and on demand at familylife.org/podcast.